So, we're through the Cave of Skulls and we're on to the Forest of Fear. We should get used to those the blank of blank titles because Doctor Who's going to be using them for literally years. Decades even. We ended the Cave of Skulls with our main characters locked in the titular Cave of Skulls, surrounded by, surprise, surprise, skulls, most of which had been split open. So now we move on and find out what happens next. My general impression of the Forest of Fear is that it's relatively violent and grisly in comparison to later Doctor Who. Now, this isn't a problem per se. Doctor Who didn't really have a formula or a template yet that it was working from. It was still kind of finding its feet and figuring out what was going on. I think that's one of the great joys of watching early Doctor Who is you get to see them kind of figuring out the kind of show that they want it to be. But if you started watching Doctor Who with its later stuff, as I did, it can be a bit jarring to go back and see how more viscerally violent the early stuff is, considering how clean Doctor Who's later violence is. In terms of the show's story, well, the politics, the caveman politics from the previous episode have not been entirely forgotten, but they're no longer the focus of the episode. The Forest of Fear is a more straightforward escape tale. Thematically, the story is also a bit more about figuring out the group dynamics of the regular characters. And again, this can be jarring if you started with later Doctor Who, because the Doctor basically ends up on the bottom of the pile with the least amount of authority. He complains a lot, but nobody really does what he says. This is a stark contrast to later Doctor Who, where the Doctor is clearly the one in charge about 99% of the time. There is a nice rising tension to the plot as they try to escape. Each delay they have clearly costs them time, and you get frequent cuts back to Za and her, the two cavemen chasing them, to make it clear how much danger that they're in. Speaking of the cavemen, let's take a look at them. We're going to start with the old woman who sets them free. Now, she is presented in a decidedly more sympathetic light than the previous episode. But the main reason she seems more sympathetic is really that she frees them rather than killing them when she breaks in to see them. It's worth noting this is probably more of a pragmatic than a compassionate decision on her part. She is, as her name suggests, an old woman, and 2, if not 3, of the captives are probably capable of physically overpowering her, even bound. Certainly Ian is. So she is essentially taking the path of least resistance. She doesn't want them to give the tribe fire, and that can be achieved by freeing them as easily as it can by killing them. She avoids the possibility of herself being hurt by choosing the former. Now, that is a fight that would most likely be determined by strength, and hers is lacking in that area, and she knows that, so she avoids the fight entirely. Unfortunately, the old woman's gift for strategy is a bit limited because she doesn't come up with a reason for why she freed them when she talks to first Za and then Cal later, and that gets her first beat up and then killed, respectively, from each of them. And that brings me to Za and Cal. Za, as I mentioned, beats the old woman up, basically throws her around the cave, and clearly injures her. She's definitely injured in the later scene where Cal finds her, and quite honestly, she's acting like she's concussed, so he was not gentle with her. It does raise the question of what is considered taboo in terms of physical violence in this culture. I would hazard a guess that it's not like ours, that a certain amount of shoving and pushing is considered normal. We see in some of the other episodes that Za does this on a fairly regular basis without any sort of consequence. And as I mentioned, this is a world where strength rules, which means it's a world where strength makes the rules. Still, Za may push her around, but Cal straight up murders the old woman. He also doesn't seem to do it in a fit of temper. Cal decides to kill her. We see him very slowly take the knife out and basically murder her. That makes it a whole different kind of act. It makes it premeditated as opposed to a loss of control. Cal chooses to end her life. In the last video, I talked a bit about the similarities and differences between Za and Cal. Both of them are violent, both of them are ambitious, both of them want to be a leader, and both of them are seeking fire to achieve that goal. I talked a bit in the last episode about how one of the chief differences between Za and Cal is that Za possesses a level of compassion that Cal doesn't. But this episode also makes it clear that one of the differences between them is the scope of their vision. Cal wants to be leader, and that's a goal of its own with nothing beyond it. Because Cal wants to be leader for its own sake, anything and anyone becomes sacrificable to achieve that goal because nothing is more important than that. He views everything through the lens of becoming leader. Cal's anger at the old woman isn't about the loss of fire, but about the loss of opportunity for leadership for him. Further, once she's dead, Cal uses her death to restart his caveman political theater from the previous episode, thus allowing him to turn the tribe against Za's vision is wider. His goals encompass Cal's goals, but they're not limited to them. Za wants to be the leader, but he also wants to be a good leader. When he gets angry at the old woman, it's not just about the loss of fire for himself, but also about seeing the tribe's future slip away. You can see this in the earlier scene where he pushes the great stone out of the way in order to try to get into the cave before she frees, or at the time he thinks kills them, because he's desperate for that resource not to disappear from the tribe. It's also interesting to note that he clearly thinks that maybe if he saves them from the old woman, this is when he thinks she's going to kill them, that they might reward him with fire, which, again, reinforces his leadership, but is also good for the tribe. I think one of the key things in this episode is that during the entire sequence of their escape and chasing them, Za doesn't really seem to be viewing this in terms of his rivalry with Cal, which cannot be said in the other direction. In fact, her needs to remind him that this would be useful for that dynamic. As she points out, leaders are awake while others sleep. It's also worth noting when she says that she was awake while Za was asleep. Because this episode continues to reinforce my belief that her is the smartest person in the tribe. Her is the intelligence behind Za's leadership, and she does a number of things in this episode that make it clear that that's the case. She frequently reminds him of things he needs to do to cement that leadership role. She works out what the old woman is doing. She recognizes that recapturing the strangers will paint Za as the leader of the tribe, which is something he really needs reinforced at this point. Za, it's worth noting, is very wary about going into the forest at night, with good reason, but she's thinking bigger picture than he is. She's thinking about something more than the physical danger of the jungle. Her doesn't just observe, but she draws conclusions from her observations in a way that the men in the story don't entirely do. The times in this episode where we see her not understand something, it's mostly because those things fall from entirely outside of her worldview. The chief one being that she doesn't seem to understand why the strangers choose to help Za after he's been injured. But that makes sense in a couple of ways. One, as I've mentioned, this is a society where strength rules, power rules. So the idea that they would be compassionate to a weaker foe is foreign to her. Further, this is also a world where medicine is all but non-existent, so it's kind of irrelevant whether or not someone would want to help someone that's injured. In her world, no one can help someone that's injured. So the idea that they're trying to, again, is just foreign to her worldview. We also see more examples in this episode that her has a real emotional attachment to Za. She's not just latching onto the strongest caveman. Because if she was, as soon as he was this injured, she would abandon him immediately. But she doesn't. She's clearly still attached to him. Indeed, she gets into a sort of a rivalry thing with Susan because she views her as a rival. As Ian says, she's jealous of her. something that would only make sense if she had an actual emotional attachment to Za. And it appears to be a gut reaction, not a carefully thought out thing. Because, some decisions are made with the heart, not the head. Speaking of Susan, let's talk about the regular characters. Susan doesn't get a whole lot to do in this episode. Yes, she is designated as the person who seems to remember the way back to the ship the best. But that's about it, in terms of action. However, in terms of character, she does get a little bit of development. Specifically, she gets development in terms of these small acts of defiance against her grandfather. She stays to aid the teachers when they decide to help Za against her grandfather's wishes. She's the one who points out that there are antibiotics on the ship when he didn't volunteer that information. And she also has a great line in there where she's talking about her grandfather and says that he's always like this when he doesn't get his own way. First of all, the look on Hartnell's face is absolutely priceless when she says that. But more than that, these little acts of defiance actually strike me as more impressive than the full-on argument she had with her grandfather back in the first episode. Because an argument is trying to change his point of view. This is acting against his point of view regardless of his wishes. It's a small bit of character development, but it is something. Poor Barbara. She's not coping well. There is a fan tendency to judge companions based on how much they scream or don't. Basically, how much they cope with what happens to them without acting scared. But the truth is, such composure is actually pretty unrealistic. Companions are routinely exposed to absolutely terrifying things, things that are actually a physical danger to them and could end their lives. Barbara has gone from her normal life as a school teacher in London to being captured and menaced and potentially killed by cavemen in what is probably less than a 24-hour period. It's no wonder she's having a little trouble coping. Jacqueline Hill plays Barbara's breakdown very, very well. She doesn't come off like someone who can't handle these things. She just seems like someone who's been bombarded with so much change and danger in rapid succession that she's just sort of hit a breaking point. It's been too much, too fast. And as we'll see as we go forward into the series, Barbara becomes a very capable adventurer. She's just not there yet. And it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense if she was. She hasn't had enough processing time. And Jacqueline Hill portrays that fantastically. Honestly, at this point, I think it's a bit of a toss-up as to whether William Hartnell or Jacqueline Hill are the better actor. In terms of realism, I think I'd actually give it to Hill. And then there's Ian and the Doctor. We kind of have to talk about them as a pair this time because so much of the episode is focused on their struggle for who's leading the party. And there are definite parallels between the Doctor and Ian and Cal and Za. Ian, like Za, is being shown to have both selfish and selfless motives for what he's doing. In terms of the selfish motives, Ian doesn't like the Doctor very much at this point. He thinks the Doctor is arrogant and cruel and egotistical, and to be perfectly honest, he's not incorrect about those things at this point in the story. But, in a more selfless vein, like Za, Ian wants to be a leader in order to make sure the right things get done and the group is safe. He wants a leadership style that gets them out of all this. When they're in the Cave of Skulls early on in the episode, he says something about, don't just lie there criticizing us, do something. Because Ian wants the Doctor or anyone to take positive action to keep them all safe. Who's in charge isn't important for its own sake to him, but important for the sake of the group. It's worth noting, he doesn't have any problem taking the Doctor's advice when he thinks that advice is sound. When the Doctor suggests cutting their bonds with the bones instead of the stones because they're sharper, Ian takes that advice because it's right. But when Ian stands his ground about things, it's not just because he doesn't like the Doctor, though he doesn't like the Doctor at this point. It's because he recognizes that the Doctor is objecting solely because he wants to be in charge, not because he wants what's best for the group. They have a conversation about the order they should be walking in. Ian wants to pick an order that will be good for the group. The Doctor seems to be objecting just because he doesn't want to take Ian's suggestion. But what Ian wants is for them to use the safest way. He's not just sticking it to the old man. The doctor, at this point in the story, is acting more like Cal. He wants to be in charge just because he wants to be in charge, or possibly specifically because he doesn't want Ian to be in charge. The doctor knows Ian isn't as smart as he is, and the doctor objects to the idea of taking orders from someone less smart than he is, not so much on an intellectual level, but on an emotional level. Ian is, as far as the doctor's concerned, a primitive, an unintelligent primitive, and the idea of an unintelligent primitive leading the party is one the doctor finds offensive. Because of this, the doctor digs in his heels about decisions that he might otherwise go with Ian on just because he objects to the idea of Ian being the one to make the decisions in the first place. For instance, what the safest walking order is, whether or not there are dangers in the forest. Yeah, he's wrong about that. In fact, he has no real reason to even believe there's no danger in the forest. It's a forest in caveman times. Of course there could be danger there. In that particular one, I think he insisted simply because he can't stand the idea that Barbara, another primitive, might be right. How has the doctor come to this conclusion that Ian and Barbara are primitives? Well, he's come to it by watching them. They didn't understand how the TARDIS worked. Ian used the wrong materials to cut their bonds. They're dumb as far as he's concerned, and he doesn't want to take orders from someone dumb. And the doctor continues to cling to this idea emotionally, even in the face of evidence to the contrary, because while not every decision Ian makes is perfect, a lot of the ones he makes are, but the doctor's not willing to acknowledge that. You know, I sometimes hear Doctor Who fans complain when the doctor gets emotional, but I've never quite understood that. The doctor is not Spock. Emotions play a strong part in the doctor's decision-making. They always have. This early on, they're just not particularly nice emotions. It feels a little weird to regard the doctor as being so selfishly driven in these early episodes, because again, he's going to progress a great deal beyond that and be a much more selfless character in the future. But it's worth noting that these early traits don't entirely disappear. The doctor will always be arrogant, and the doctor will always kind of put themselves in charge, and will always want to be in charge, even when the doctor claims they don't. That having been said, there are small indications, again, that there's more to the doctor than we've seen thus far. For instance, there is the classic line that he spouts in this episode, "Fear makes companions of us all." It's a bit of a mixed line. There is some pragmatism to it. He's talking to Barbara, and it is in his interest that Barbara doesn't completely freak out. But it does seem very spontaneous, and when he goes on to talk about the value of hope, it does seem very genuine. I always like Barbara's reaction to the line. She's very surprised. The doctor's been so abusive to her throughout the previous two episodes that the idea that he might say something genuinely compassionate to her seems to catch her completely off guard. Still, the doctor, as I said, is a long way from the doctor we will later know. One of these ways in which he's different is on a purely physical level. The doctor gets completely exhausted in this episode. This is in stark contrast to these sort of endless fountains of energy versions of the doctor that we'll get used to in later incarnations, or arguably even parts of later Hartnell. But in this episode, despite claiming that he isn't the weakest link in the party, he's clearly the weakest link in the party. At this point, the doctor not only looks like an old man, he acts like an old man. Plus, the doctors are wrong a lot in this episode. Now, it's hardly unheard of for the doctor to be wrong about something later, but it's very prevalent in this episode. He's wrong about whether there's a danger from animals in the forest. He's wrong about whether the cavemen have logic and reason. I always like that it cuts immediately from that to Za and her working out what to do to catch them. It's primitive logic and reason, but it serves its purpose and it proves him wrong. He's wrong about whether the old woman will tell the tribe where they went. Again, we get an immediate cut to her not doing that. The doctor, as presented in this episode, is intensely fallible. One of the things that makes it work, though, is that William Hartnell chooses, and will continue to choose this going forward, to play the doctor's level of confidence when he's wrong exactly the same as when he's right. I imagine that as an actor, there was probably a temptation to sort of kind of let the audience in on the joke that the Doctor was wrong, sort of make it satirical or parodic, but he doesn't. When the Doctor's making a pronouncement about something, Hartnell plays it the exact same way, whether he's right or wrong, which I think was a brilliant choice on his part, and the way to go. Now, I can't talk about the Forest of Fear without talking about the elephant in the room, or the elephant in the forest, which is the rock scene. The scene where they're arguing about whether or not to take Za back to the ship, and the Doctor seems to have lost that argument, so he picks up a rock and starts to move towards Za before Ian catches him. The fairly obvious implication being that he was going to end this argument by bashing Za's head in with the rock, so that there was nothing left to argue about anymore. I've seen this scene debated for decades. Some people think he was going to bash Za's head in. Some people think that is so out of character for the Doctor, as we know him, as to basically be impossible. I think he was going to bash Za's head in. I mostly base this around Hartnell's acting in the scene. When Ian catches him, and he comes up with the excuse that he was going to get Za to draw their way back to the TARDIS, it doesn't come off like he's explaining. It comes off like he's coming up with a weak lie to try and get out of having been caught. He seems like a guilty man trying to get out of blame, not an innocent man who's been wrongly accused. Yes, it's far from the later character of the Doctor. But it's worth noting that the later character of the Doctor is a product of these early stories. He doesn't predate them. It's through going through these experiences that the Doctor becomes the more heroic character that we know him to be later. It's also worth noting that when I say I think he intended to kill Za, I believe that was his initial intention. That doesn't necessarily mean he could have gone through with it. It's one thing to contemplate murder, it's another thing to actually commit it. So yes, I think he picked up that rock fully intending to bash Za's head in, but I'm not entirely sure he could have brought himself to go through with it. It's quite possible that that same instinct that surfaced last episode when he chose to save Ian might surface this time and prevent him from actually murdering Za. I mean, the truth is, we've seen the Doctor kill people many, 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 many times over the coming on 6 decades of the series now. He just doesn't usually do it directly, and he doesn't usually do it for selfish reasons, but the Doctor ending someone's life is not actually outside of character. Then again, there's also the question of, is it really a selfish motivation? Because one of the Doctor's chief motivations at this point in his life is keeping himself and his granddaughter safe, and as far as he's concerned, ending Za would probably do that. So, this episode does mark some interesting things to look at in terms of the Doctor's character. There's also some other little things I think are worth exploring in the episode. I think the cuts are done very well. You get a great cut at the beginning of the old woman breaking into the Cave of Skulls, and then you cut away from that scene, leaving the audience with the belief that she may still be there to murder the regular characters. It's only later that we find out that she's planning on freeing them, so you keep some tension there. I also like the shot when Barbara falls and screams when she sees the severed boar's head, because then they immediately cut to Za and her, and the scream is very loud, making it clear how close Za and her are to them, how much they've caught up to the escaping prisoners. I like that what the cavemen call knives are basically just flat, sharpened rocks, but of course that's what cavemen would call knives. It's not as if they can machine tool these things. You also get a slight continuation of that interesting caveman language from the last episode. I liked Cal talking about, my eyes tell me things as they do when I'm asleep. It was a very colorful description of what we would now just call a dream. In terms of camera work, I think the attack on Za is very well done, all from the point of view of the creature attacking him, thus getting around the fact that the show clearly didn't have the budget to create the creature itself, whatever the beast of the forest is. In the novelization, I'm pretty sure it was a saber-toothed tiger, but we don't really get a full description of what it was in the episode. But that point of view shot, and then the cuts to the regulars' faces during the attack, or even just the look of of fear on Zah's face as he's attacked convey the terror and the brutality of the moment really well, even if we don't see it. I mean, the truth is, Doctor Who will often be punching above its weight in terms of what it can achieve in terms of special effects, but it will also often find creative ways to get around that, to give the impressions that it's trying to give, to have the effect that it's trying to have, even if it can't fully realize its concepts. It's one of the great joys of watching the show, is to see how they figure that out. Plot-wise, I also like that the tribe catches up with them fairly easily. That's not really surprising. This is the tribe's territory. They know this forest, but the main characters do not. Further, the main characters keep delaying. The Doctor keeps slowing the main travelers down. Every time he stops to argue or he stops just to rest, they slow down. And then, of course, they stopped to help Zah, which took a fair amount of time. And then they started carrying Zah on a stretcher, which slows them down even more. As I think about it, it's almost a bit surprising that they didn't get caught earlier. One wonders if Cal, rather than trying to follow them through the forest, just made his way to the strange tree that he saw in the previous episode, the TARDIS, and just waited for them there. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's what he did, but given the way the cavemen sort of rise from behind the rocks as they approach the TARDIS. And then we get a cliffhanger shot at the end, which is Cal basically staring at the main characters. It's a great shot. Cal just looks, frankly, evil in that shot. It's very well done. And that's where we leave off. Feel free to comment below. I'd love to hear other people's takes on the episode. I'm always interested in other opinions. And, like, share, subscribe, all that good YouTube stuff. And next time we will find out what happens next.